always telling your stories, and it's time someone tells ours. We're humans first, journalists second. We chose this career to give you a voice. Now we're voicing ours. It's true, journalism has much room for improvement, but not all hope is lost, and we want your trust back by humanizing one journalist at a time. We're sharing with you what we go through to bring you the news. The pain, the tears, the trauma, and the mental health struggles. It's painful, and sometimes we even work 2 jobs to make ends meet. But we all have something in common. The passion, the joy, and the love we feel for storytelling and holding the powerful accountable. That includes holding ourselves accountable. So here are stories from us. This is how we want to help improve the news industry. The Awakened Journalist is proud to present Media Healers by Emiliana Molina Fajardo. Hi everyone, welcome back to The Awakened Journalist and our special project Media Healers. Today we have the privilege of having with us Rafael Mathus Ruiz. He's an economist and the US Correspondent for the Argentine newspaper La Nacion. Rafael began his career as a foreign correspondent in New York in 2010 after completing his studies in journalism and economics at Columbia University. He has worked in Buenos Aires as a finance and economics reporter, covering 3 presidential campaigns in the United States and the 2018 presidential campaign in Mexico. His work has been featured in more than 20 countries across the world, and he is the co-author of Los Legalizadores, a book about the legalization of cannabis in the United States, published by Editorial Planeta, the largest Spanish publisher. Rafael, welcome, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful. Rafa, so let's start with the basics. How did you begin your career as a journalist?
It happened around 2005. I studied economics back home in Mendoza, Argentina. I started working as an economist, but I quickly realized that I wanted to travel. I wanted to tell stories. I wanted to be part of events, part of the conversations of my time. So after working in Europe as an economist for a multinational American company that dealt with public services and utilities as a consultant, I decided to start studying journalism and to engage with journalism. So I moved to Buenos Aires. I studied journalism at the Universidad Torcuato y Tella, and after that, I started working for La Nacion newspaper as an economics reporter. As you know, economics and finance in Argentina is quite a very hard topic. It's very difficult. Economy is quite a unique and very challenging economic environment, very difficult and very interesting to report on. So I joined La Nacion newsroom as an economist reporting on the Argentine economy and the global financial crisis. And a few years later, I moved to New York to continue my studies in journalism and finance and economics.
Wonderful. That actually leads me to one of the stories you told me. So we'll dive right in to your coverage of the assassination of Osama bin Laden. He was killed by US forces during a raid on his compound hideout in Pakistan. And the 54-year-old leader of Al-Qaeda, the terrorist network of the Islamist extremists, was responsible for the September 11 attacks in the US. And you were actually, I believe you mentioned you were in New York when this happened and the news story, the breaking news started kind of evolving. Can you speak a little bit about that experience for you?
Yeah, sure. I remember very vividly, it was a Sunday. I was having drinks with a few friends when the correspondent, a colleague here in Washington, Jose Díaz Briceño, we were both working for Reforma of Mexico City back then, called me and dropped the bombs. He dropped news that, Obama was about to announce that Osama bin Laden had been killed in a special operation. I jumped on a cab and I went back home. I went straight back home. I lived in Brooklyn at the moment. And I started working on a story, on updating the profile that we had been working on, Osama bin Laden. And then right after I filed that story, I turned on the news and I saw that there was a very spontaneous manifestation, group of people, young people celebrating in Ground Zero, the place where the attacks on September 11 had happened. So I jumped on the subway and I went to Ground Zero and I started talking to people. It was a very strange scene because there was a lot of young people celebrating, chanting. It was a very joyful atmosphere. There were some drunk young people also shouting, hooray for American exceptionalism. And amidst that very particular scene, I saw a young woman crying, and she said that she had a lot of problems trying to reconciliate the scene that she was witnessing with the fact that as Americans, you cannot celebrate someone being killed, even if that person is Osama bin Laden. I still remember very vividly the image of this young woman crying in front of these kids celebrating. But and I think it was a very clear reflection of how the country felt at that particular moment. There were a lot of very conflictive and mixed emotions that very quickly surfaced after the announcement made by the Obama administration. And that kind of celebration exploded in very major cities across the United States, despite the fact that what had happened was the special operation that had ended in the killing of Osama bin Laden.
How did that feel for you? What were the emotions running through your whole body at that moment, especially seeing that woman?
Well, it was one of the first. It was the first big breaking news story that I had to report on as a correspondent working in the United States. And I remember that I was very impressed by this woman's reflection and her ability to try to summarize the conflicting values that were juxtaposing the fact that, on one hand, the United States had managed to take out a well-known terrorist responsible for the death of thousands of people. But at the same time, that went into conflict or could conflict with some of the country's values. I very quickly thought that I remember I made her the lead of my story. She became the lead on the story, and I quickly realized how important is to be present, to be where the news is happening, to talk to people, to engage with as many people as possible, and also that as a journalist, especially as a correspondent, and in a country like the US, you will always find it very challenging to engage with people's emotions and people's conflicts, and it's very important to try to reflect that in the most brutal way possible, to try to be as clear as possible with whatever is going on at the moment on the ground.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And then after that news coverage, I'm wondering, did you have resources or guidance as to how to cope with the aftermath of the reporting, or how did you cope with the reportings? Because I know it was definitely a traumatic news coverage for a lot of journalists that had to endure that.
Yeah. No, I've never had any counseling or any kind of support in terms of therapy or nothing that you can relate to that. luckily, I don't think I've ever been exposed to a very traumatic reporting experience. I've talked to a lot of people who have been part of very traumatic events. And of course, that puts you in direct contact with some very intense emotions. And eventually that gets to you. It has happened to me while covering shootings, for instance. When you talk to people that are either relatives or friends of victims of mass shootings. I report on like too many mass shootings here in the United States because it's something that keeps happening over and over and over again.
And I think you
And
mentioned you were at Sandy Hook, no?
yeah, in 2012, yeah. And that, for instance, is a situation where you just spend like many days on a single story, dealing with, murder, loss, grief, sorrow, anger, frustration, and eventually, of course, it's impossible to detach entirely of the news reporting or the subjects that you talk to while reporting. Going back to 9/11, I remember when the 10-year anniversary hit. That was my second year working as a correspondent in New York City. And I did this long interview with the father of an Argentine paramedic that died responding to the attacks. So he was a paramedic, he was working in New York City, he was off the day of the attack, but as soon as he saw the news, he went straight back to work, and he went directly to ground zero, and he died buried when one of the towers collapsed. I had a really long interview with the father. The interview was published, and I remember the interview was published. I talked again with the father, and he had read the interview, and he was very moved by the interview, and we had a very impactful conversation, and we both ended up crying. And I remember like hanging up, and I just remember like sobbing for like 5 minutes or so. And that was the end of like a full week reporting on the anniversary of 9/11, talking to survivors of the attack, talking to relatives of the victims, like dwelling with the loss, and being there the day of the ceremony when they read the names of all the people who died. And that was, to me, that was the first time that something like that happened. And I think it's very telling of how the work that we do eventually, we might think that doesn't affect us. We might think that, it's okay. We just go there, try to be as impartial as we can be as witnesses, and to tell the story. But eventually, everything hits you at some point, and sometimes when you don't even know.
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree 100%. It's very difficult work. There's a lot of heaviness around certain news stories, especially the 9/11 or the mass school shootings. And I think that, like part of Media Healers is creating this awareness so that journalists can actually have enough resources to cope with the aftermath of very difficult news coverage. And I'm wondering, Rafa, for example, in that instance where you kind of broke down after a week of covering this, and completely valid, 100% valid, how could you not break down? What helps you move forward? Like what do you do to cope?
I wish I had a sophisticated, very polished answer about how we go about this, but the truth is that we just keep going. Or at least I just keep going. I just move on from one news coverage to the next. I don't think we are completely aware of the impact that our work has on our mental health, on our well-being. I've never thought of journalism as something that could be harmful for me, or something that could be toxic for my mental stability or for my health. I think, and like I said, I've never been exposed to the trauma of being kidnapped or being subject to intimidation or being afraid of my own life, like some journalists, some colleagues who work in Mexico, for instance, in Afghanistan, or in war zones, in conflict zones, like we've seen right now, like working in Ukraine, people who are like working knowing that they can die that day or the next day or the following day. But at the same time, it's like you said, there are like certain coverages that eventually take a toll. But I never pause and think, oh, what is the damage that working on this story, on this coverage has created? I think I just move on to the next story and just keep going. Even though, there have been many instances, Sandy Hook, 9/11, or even covering presidential campaigns in the UN, which can be very feisty and emotionally intense. People are super, super engaged, in this country during presidential campaigns. But like I said, I think we just keep going. I think a lot of us, I think we're also hooked to the news cycle. We live in this, not in the thrill of the moment, because when you say thrill of the moment, it sounds like something fun and exciting. It is fun and exciting, but at the same time, we're reporting on things that are not fun and exciting, so it's a little bit weird to call them thrilling. But I think we just keep moving from news cycle to news cycle. I do have to say that after a few years in Washington and after covering the Trump presidency, which was a very, very complicated and challenging time, I felt a level of exhaustion that I've never felt before. Like I felt for the first time the need to disengage, and to disengage completely, to just go to some place where I could be completely isolated from the news. And even then, because of technology, which is a blessing, but at the same time it's very annoying. It's impossible to disengage, because even when I'm like not working and I'm far away, I'm still checking the news. I'm still reading Twitter. I still have this reflex to tweet about it, to be part of the conversation, to be involved in whatever the news of the day is. And it takes me longer and longer to find a place where I can detach from my job, detach from my work, and just relax and find a little bit of peace. That is becoming much, much more difficult, especially after working in Washington for a few years.
Yeah, I actually turned off all of my notifications on my phone, even Twitter. So I don't see like the news unless I specifically go on Twitter or go on Instagram, just because I cannot be plugged in 24/7 anymore.
But you end up going to Twitter, right?
Yeah, I'll go on it.
This is the problem. That's exactly the problem. Even if you turn on notifications, eventually you're gonna wonder, it's like, what's going on?
Exactly.
I need to know what's going on. Yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a problem because it's hard to disconnect sometimes. But when you do it, and when you are actually able to unplug yourself from your cell phone, it's the best thing in the world, because it's like recharging.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Rafa, and that leads me to the next question. You were speaking about presidential campaigns, and you were also actually in the middle of the protests when President Trump was in the White House and decided to, I believe it was June 1st, walk across the street, Lafayette Park, to the St. John's Church, the yellow church right in front of the White House, that had been damaged by a fire the night before. And he did this with the help of police officers that were tear gassing protesters to open up the space and the road so that President Trump could actually go into the church and take a picture with a Bible. He didn't pray. He didn't acknowledge the protests that were happening. He didn't speak about George Floyd at the time, and these were a lot of Black Lives Matter protests happening. He simply went in there to do a photo op, and I believe the bishop of the Episcopal diocese in Washington wasn't even aware that the president was going to make this move. How can you tell us your whole experience and your story around that situation?
Yeah, so that happened after Memorial Day weekend when George Floyd was murdered. That ignited a wave of racial protests across the United States, people demanding for racial justice, for the end of police brutality. As a New York correspondent, I remember that I covered the case of Eric Garner, which was a very high-profile case at the moment of police brutality. And I remember having that sense that, I also reported on the Black Lives Matter movement and so on. And I always remembered that thinking that police brutality was a situation similar to mass shootings, that it didn't matter how often they occurred. It didn't matter how much we knew about them and how much information about the different cases of police brutality appear on the news. Very little things changed. Very little things changed. You had a few democratic states that have changed a few rules in terms of policing to try to prevent these things from happening, but there was no big major change in terms of the country as a whole or legislation as a whole. And I remember when I saw the first video of George Floyd's murder, thinking that it was the worst that I've ever seen. It was the worst case of police brutality that I saw as a correspondent in the US. And I was there the night before. Trump orchestrated that photo op in front of the church. And that was a very, very agitated and violent environment. Very, very violent environment. It was the first time that I've been physically charged by the police. I was there in the front lines with the protesters. I remember that for a very stupid reason, I had my bike with me because I've been on my bike reporting around the city all day in the protest. I was wearing my bike helmet, which is the only protection I had, and I had my press pass. I had everything with me, identifying as a reporter. And I remember that when the cops started moving, with a very solid line towards the protesters, and I think this is partly my fault because of my inexperience being involved in this type of situations. I identify myself as a reporter, thinking that, okay, the police was just going to let me stay in the scene reporting. That was a mistake. I was charged by the police. I was thrown on the ground by the police along with the rest of the protesters. I was not beaten up or anything, but I was very violently thrown into the ground by this very huge police officer with a big shield made of plastic. So I did what everybody did. We all started running away from the police. That was a night where downtown DC was set on fire. A lot of vandalism occurred. A lot of people broke windows, broke cars, set cars on fires. Because there was a lot of people who were very, very upset and very, very angry. Nothing that justifies the violence, but it definitely gives you an idea, I think, of the level of frustration that had built up to that moment, and it all exploded altogether. So I remember the following day, we were with a few colleagues in front of Lafayette Square, and it was a very quiet afternoon. It was a super quiet afternoon, like 10, 15 minutes before it all started. There was no violence or aggressive attitude from the protest. Some of the protesters were just like kneeling down on the floor or sitting down with their fist up. And the police was just like standing in line inside the Lafayette Park, sort of like trying to, I would say in a defensive posture. They were not aggressive.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they started moving forward. And I remember listening, hearing the first like bangs from the tear gas, and it all changed. The whole situation changed very rapidly in a matter of like seconds, not even minutes, that we started seeing the police moving forward, people running and tear gas everywhere. I remember seeing a lot of like young kids throwing milk in their eyes, which is a way to deal with the irritation and the cheering from the tear gas. And in a matter of just like a few minutes, the police have moved and had cleared everything away. And I had to like run away with a couple of colleagues. We tried to like, first we ran, then we came back, then we were pushed again, from the tear gas. I never smelled tear gas. That was the first time I actually smelled tear gas in my entire life. And I was completely shocked. I never thought that was going to happen just a few meters away from the White House, and in a situation that was not violent like whatsoever. It was not violent like not whatsoever. I remember it was kind of late in the afternoon, so I had to file. So I don't live that far away, so I can like rush back home to write my story and file. And that's when I saw Trump walking to the church to orchestrate that photo op, which to me was very shocking. Not just because we had just been there, but because it was clear at that moment that he wanted the people to be pushed away in a very violent way from the square so he could go and orchestrate that photo op to reassure basically his base that he was in charge, that he was in control, that protesters were not going to be something that he was going to respond to, that they were something that he was going to, repress to some extent. And we came back the next day, of course, like everybody came back the next day, but then the police presence that day was much more heavy, and it was also like much more subdued. There was no tear gas that day. There was nothing. There was just a very, very heavy police presence that made clear that all the area around the White House, around Lafayette, were just like off limits for the protesters. Looking back, I think that was a very clear turning point for a lot of people on how Trump really went about the use of power, and what was that he was going to do or that he was willing to do in order to make sure that people were aware that his power was not to be challenged.
Yeah, a completely unjustifiable way of moving out protesters simply to get a message across in an image where he truly didn't even pray or acknowledge the reality.
It was just a picture, and that's it.
Yeah.
Just a picture.
Rafa, question for you. Did you ever report what happened to you with the police officer? Because I know a lot of our colleagues in DC had similar situations and reported it.
Yeah, no, I didn't. I think I really don't know why. I think I wasn't harmed or anything. Like I said, it was violent, but I was fine. I know a few colleagues that had their equipment broken, cameras broken, and so on. And I remember I saw some videos in Twitter where the police would actually beat reporters who were working on the scene. Luckily, I was not one of them. But then I think also, like, no one told me, like, I didn't think of it at the moment. Again, I think I was just like very like caught up in the reporting. There were like very, very hectic days where it was very difficult to keep up with the news cycle. It was like everything was happening at such a fast pace that we were just like struggling to like keep up, right? Yeah. Keep up. And bear in mind that, I don't have, I'm the US correspondent, so I'm the US. It's not that I have, people working with me or staff or anything. I don't have a staff. So, and for a lot of correspondents, it's the same. It's a very solitary work. We do most of the work by ourselves, most of the organizing, and we rely a lot on each other for help, for assistance. But at that point, no one, I don't remember even thinking about it. I just kept on working.
Yeah, which is what a lot of journalists do most of the time. Like, they just continue working and move on to the next news story. Because we've been trained to operate that way. We've been trained to just continue reporting on the news. But the Trump administration was definitely a lot of survival mode and trying to catch up with every single tweet every second of the day. It was exhausting. Rafa, so with that said, what do you think the news industry can improve on? Or what do you think we can do better to protect journalists, to help us not, be working on survival mode or autopilot, moving on to the next news story, but rather processing what has happened, what we've gone through to better move forward?
I think that there's so much that could be done. There is a lot of focus on the more extreme cases. Journalists who work in conflict zones, in wars, journalists who work in dictatorships or country where journalists are actively persecuted because, criminals or people who control power, they don't like the work that we do. They don't like having people asking difficult questions on reporting on the impact of the damage that, corruption, crime, drug trafficking, people trafficking, smuggling, you name it, is causing on a society. I think just raising awareness on the issue, it's important. I also think that companies, news media companies, could devote more resources and time to the mental health of journalists, knowing that there are situations that, I don't want to use the word trauma because I think trauma is a very serious thing and it's a very acute situation, and I don't think I have trauma, or I don't think I have traumatic experience, but I think there could be more help devoted to how to deal with some of the situations that we have discussed. It could be something that was also discussed in journalism schools, in journalism seminars. I don't think there is a very clear idea of how many people in this industry are affected by some sort of like how stress affects people working in the industry. And there is no book, there's no protocol on how to deal with these situations. Everything that we've talked about, every situation I've been through, I've dealt with on my own. No one told me this is how you can better handle this. This is how you can go through this experience. No one has taught me also how to handle with specific reporting situations that could be harmful or stressful. You know, we have courses, like if you want to be a war correspondent, there are courses and teach you how, like the basics of survival, but that's it. Nothing that goes beyond that. Ultimately, I think though, one of the best ways to deal with it is to just have more resources devoted to the industry. You know, every journalist that I know, or say like maybe 9 out of 10 journalists that I know, is trying to cover, trying to abarcar más de lo que se puede, ¿no? To try to reach more than it's healthy or than it's maybe like possible, you know? So we are all under a lot of pressure, we work under immense pressure. We all want to deliver, you know, we all want to do our work in the best possible way and to try to portray reality in the best possible way. And that demands a lot of time, a lot of our time, more time that even that's what's regularly devoted to like work. You know, I often say that it is said that, you know, the work of a foreign correspondent is 24/7, and I say it's actually 24/7. That's not something that we say because I start working when I wake up, and the moment I reach my phone and I start like reading news, reading email and scanning emails, and I do work until you know I go to bed, and the last thing I do is to just like check on the news and send myself some notes for maybe something the next day. Of course, I have moments for myself, but even those moments when I'm like with friends or going out, etc., I'm still very much aware and connected to the news. What we discussed before of how it's very easy to like unplug. And of course, yeah, if you know, I think it's true for me, and I think it's true for any journalist. If there were more people working on this, if there were more people devoted to this, I think we would all have a better situation, more support, more time, more ways to deal with this that we've been discussing. And also news would be better. You know, it's a fact. When you devote more resources to news productions, the news production is better. I think I think there's a lot to be done. And I think just the fact that people are talking about it like you and in this way, it's important because it helps to create more awareness in the thing.
Dale, sorry.
That's all.
It's important to bring our awareness. Si quieres, retómalo de ahí.
Okay. I think the more people are talking about this and the more people are conscious about this, it helps because raising awareness on this issue is the first step to start thinking about solution for it.
Yeah, no, I agree. How do you think the news industry, or how have you seen it changed since you started till now?
Well, it's funny to mention because, you know, I consider myself a bit of a dinosaur in the industry, and I'm not that old. I'm not that old.
You're not, yeah.
When I started working, newspapers were just newspapers. And that was it, you know. And I trained to be a newspaper reporter, right? And now I do. I write stories. I take pictures. I take videos. I do live shots for social media. I do live shots for TV, and I think that's it. Oh, I know, and I also do podcasts every now and then, you know. So I think it's great that as a journalist we have so many platforms, different platforms to tell a story, because some stories are better to tell them or to show them on video. Some stories are nicer to write them down, you know, to create this narrative on paper that it's a very specific craft, and I really enjoy doing that. And other issues are just better to just talk about them in a podcast, to have like an open conversation or a debate. So I think it's great that we have so many different platforms now to tell a story. But it would be much better if we had, at the same time, many more people working on all those different platforms and not the same amount of people covering all the platforms, which is a little bit what we have in the industry nowadays. And I think it is a problem. It is a problem. Unfortunately, it is a problem that I don't see a very clear solution. You know, I don't see anyone saying this is how we're going to solve this, because even the New York Times, which in many ways is like the poster child for a business model, the newsroom of the New York Times has shrunk, you know, and I think they're expanding now, but you know, you also see people in the New York Times doing a lot of things at the same time. I do feel super jealous when I see these stories in the Washington Post, and you see the byline that there's like 3 people in the byline, and then you read the whole story, and then you reach to the bottom of the story, and there is like the names of all the people who collaborated with the story.
Yeah.
So on top of the 3 people in the byline, they have like 8 more people, you know, who had collaborated with the story. So and that to me is one of the most impressive things. When I see the stories, I'm like, wow, there's like 16 people who work on a single article. That's mind-blowing. That's mind-blowing, particularly because there are days when I just publish like maybe like 1, 2, or 3 articles on a single day on the newspaper. So I think that's a problem, and I hope eventually that problem is going to be solved, but I don't see any news organization having a very clear idea of how we're going to solve that in the future.
Yeah, because it's piling on more work on one single person to try to cover as much as possible, but it comes with a whole bunch of issues. So
we're like news junkies, so we also like take on that, you know. It's like we can't like accept that reality, because in a way, we're news junkies, so that's also a problem.
And we're passionate about our work, so yeah. Rafa, is there anything else you want to add that I didn't ask you?
No, thank you so very much. I very much enjoyed talking about this with you.
Thank you. I enjoyed having you, and thank you for sharing your experiences. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you. You too.
Journalist, this one's for you, to help you heal, to help you understand your worth, and to help you know you're not alone. So share the love and subscribe to Spotify and YouTube, and follow us on Instagram. The Awakened Journalist is proud to present Media Healers by Emiliana Molina Fajardo.